Colleagues, we're going to talk about the global dynamic because this really was global in scale. And again, the Commission's work starts on the ground in Canada and then goes to countries that in our Canadian imagination we always associated as being the focal or starting point for the catastrophes that we ourselves were enduring. And yet it turned out that many of the dynamics were very similar. So that when I talk about India or Uganda or parts of Europe or parts of Latin America as having had educational catastrophe, childhood catastrophe, third bucket, any other description, under education, under socialization, we say, yeah, but maybe that happened in Uganda, but surely not here. And I said, you'd be surprised, right? And let us not be glib, because the human dynamic was almost exactly the same. And so we're really delighted to have 4 key members of the Commission from important regions and important countries. Shantha Sinha may be known to many of you. She is literally India's most important child's right activist and defender, former chairperson of the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights in India, and Shantha has been with us on the Commission from day one. Fiona Kiggundu, Executive Director, Project Princess Initiative in Uganda. We're really delighted. It's a big get for us because, as Fiona will explain, in Uganda the schools were closed for the longest without interruption of any other country, of any country in the world. Eszter Salamon is Director of Parents International, based in the Netherlands, but she's Hungarian and can speak to a number of European countries. And Biljana Maslovaric is Professor of Preschool Education, University of Montenegro, and head of the Pedagoski Centar in Montenegro. So a warm round of applause for our guests from all continents. Now, when we talk about what we estimated during the pandemic to be as many, if not more, than 500 million, 500 million third bucket kids, we're talking about many tens of thousands in Canada and many millions in the United States, but we really get to scale when we talk about what we learned to be the most catastrophic region for this ouster and the education catastrophe, that is the South Asian region, much more than any other region we could inspect, because first of all, the countries are huge, and unlike Northeastern Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, the systems did not hold up under the pressure of the pandemic. And so where China had very little third bucket, South Korea, Japan, almost none at all, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, very large. So I can think of no one better than Shantha Sinha to start us off. Shantha, tell us a little bit about what happened in India.
Let me first of all thank Irvin and his team for giving me this opportunity. And I had listened to several Zoom meetings that he had, and it actually, the word energy, it gave me the energy to be more positive about what was happening in India, rather than look at it in an absolutely hopeless manner. What COVID did for 2 years of closure of schools, I think it's, in a way, what it did for children seems to be so similar to other countries. You know, in India, we have 247.8 million children who are of the school-going age, and 1.5 million schools. After the school closure, every child was out of school because there was no school. And before COVID, it was estimated that 6% of children were actually out of school. 6 million children were out of school. But soon after the pandemic, there was an estimate of the national government, the NSS data, which said that third bucket children whom we talk about were about 32 million children. And as you know, most government statistics are always under than the actual figure. So when you say 32 million, could be easily the double number of children who were actually out of school. And during COVID, let me tell you, the status of children was simply, I would say, especially of the poor and the marginalized communities, were simply totally unacceptable. We had millions of children who joined the labor force. It really told us that the school's role was to protect children from labor. That is how it became very evident. And many boys went off to the labor force just because there was no livelihood, there was no income in the families, and so children were forced to go out to work. It's not just the boys, even the girls had to go out to work, and you find that during agriculture season, there were again millions of girls who were picking chilies, who were on rice farms, who were on lime farms, who were on vegetable farms. So you found girls also going out to work. The condition of girls was much worse because of patriarchy and gender discrimination in the family. So they were not allowed any other mobility other than going out to work. And within the family, they had to do all the chores. Some of the stories were really, quite painful, because many of these girls didn't have sanitary towels, didn't have money to buy soaps, and there were children who were fighting with each other for these very essential elements because they didn't have cash in the house. They had to share food grains, and because the public distribution system, the civil supplies also did not work. So, children went through hunger, through anxiety, through depression, and through a loss of confidence. Older children who in fact aspired to complete 10th grade, go to the 12th, go to colleges perhaps, all their dreams of further education totally crushed. Even to reach up to 10th grade for girls is a matter of struggle. It's not easy for the poor. Sometimes I say it is like winning a lottery ticket if you had reached up to the 10th grade. And you find that these girls reached up to the 9th grade, 10th grade, and all of a sudden, they don't know what to do, and they were under pressure of child marriage. So it was bad for girls and boys. After the pandemic, there are figures that say that the girls' dropout is much less than the boys' dropout, which actually shows the aspiration of girls for education is far more. I was also quite surprised when I looked at that. And the condition of boys worsened. They were so addicted to the smartphones, they were so addicted to all kinds of porn sites, and also alcoholic. Drugs started coming into many of their slums and the villages and the habitations they lived in. So we have lost boys totally. While girls still had the aspiration to study, it's going to be very difficult to get boys back into school because they're so demotivated and they're totally lost. Especially the adolescent boys are so, and nobody is talking about them. And I am talking about it in an anecdotal fashion. There is not really any survey about it, but wherever I go, I talk. And I listen to what is happening in the community across the country. They talk about the disaster for boys. And that girls, it's not that girls are doing very good, but then somewhere their motivation levels have been stronger than the motivation levels of boys. So this is what has happened in the country. And of course, hunger. 131 million children were malnourished during this period. It is again a national. Finally, I would like to talk about the online education, which all of us have talked about. The only attempt the government made was to see that they would have some pretense of education through online. Even online I wouldn't go back into the reasons, we all know very well, it just did not work. And we find again the pressure on the poor parents to buy smartphones for children. The pressure on the children to work more to buy smartphones for themselves. Just having a smartphone was not enough. There was no electricity, they didn't have the capacity to download, and the teachers were at a loss. They didn't know what kind of lessons to make all of a sudden on a smartphone. They were not used to it, and so it became a kind of a farcical intervention for children. I would like to talk about it much more later, because this farcical intervention that did come created a huge space for technocracy. And that is the crisis we are in at the moment. But I think I will give my colleagues the chance to talk more. And I would just say that it has been really a horror story for children and their lives. And they have yet not recovered from it. One more thing, the government did nothing. But then I wouldn't blame the government, but when you talk about children and their rights, I think there could have been some more noise about children and their well-being, rather than pretending that children didn't exist.
Thank you, Shantha. And we'll go to the practical, because India, despite the size of the catastrophe and the urgency, there were some hints where some states did a little bit of the yard-to-yard to which Knut was referring, and we'll get to that to see what some of the post-pandemic work was. But India is the future of Asia in many ways, and the future of the planet, so that's important for us to seize. Before we get to Europe, let's go to Uganda and Fiona. I can't overstate our joy that you're here with us.
Thank you very much, Irvin. My name is Fiona, like they've said. I'm from Uganda, and I bring you greetings. First of all, thank you so much for putting together this phenomenal, important, and critical body of work. This is amazing to realize that we've all come together in the interest of education. Some of us coming from Africa probably would not be here if it were not for education. So I'm very passionate about education, the only way up for some of us. Thank you. So in the context of Uganda, I'll just first give you some figures so that you understand when I talk about first bucket and second bucket and third, so you understand the context. Uganda's population stands currently at 48 million people, and of the 48 million people, 75% is people under 35 years of age. And then of the 75, 54 is under the age of 18. So when we talk about effect in Uganda for us, it was 17 million people, 17 million kids that were affected. When we go to the buckets, as we know them, the percentage for first bucket in my country was almost non-existent. And I would also want to point out that Uganda ranks on the world rankings, ranks 26th, one of the poorest countries in the world. So put that in context and understand that first bucket kids were not that many. Kids who could actually access devices, kids who had any sort of private teaching, kids who had Zoom or things like that were actually very limited, given the kind of poverty that where we stand as a country. 46.2% live under a certain level of poverty of about $3,324 a year. So you can imagine such people cannot actually access the kind of devices we are talking about. So we have about 80% of the population of school-going kids in Uganda as third bucket. And I mean, that is like really serious. And from a point of an educator and a child activist and a girl empowerment person like me, it was, a total disaster for us back there. So the effects are similar. Everybody here has mentioned from Canada. Note that this is my first time in Canada. I've traveled everywhere, somewhere, but not here. So I'm listening to all these people going like, we had this and we had this, and I'm thinking this is similar to where I come from, but the kids took a hit. And in my country, it was a really, really, really bad one because of the population, as you heard, and also of the poverty. And the effects were schools closed, longest in the world. We were closed more than any other country, and very mobile. Kids were disturbed. The disruption went on for too long. Guys, there's something that has to be done, and I'm glad we're here. Like they said for us, about 28% of the boy child did not return to school. When the poverty hit, because everything stopped. In my country, only 3 sectors kept working. We had security, we had medical, and we have transport. And transport basically was to transport dead bodies or transport medical supply. So basically, the whole country was immobile. And as much as it was a public health measure, it was also very, very dangerous to the kids. And so children dropped out of school, numbers that are just completely amazing. The boys, 28%, went into child labor with permission from their parents, actually. It was like, yeah, go, because there was so much poverty in the house. And as you can imagine, school protects children from a lot of things. They spend so many hours at school, and they are protected from violence, they're protected from hunger because they served a meal at school. They are protected, their energies are expended. And you can imagine why there was all this is because there was no energy expansion. The word is refusing to come out. So they couldn't expend the energy. And we wonder why. But if you have ever had a birthday and you hosted one, by the time they're done, one of your kids will be completely distraught. Why? Because the young people have a lot of energy. It has to be expended, and they had no way of letting it out. And so they had permission from their parents to go into the labor market, join as early as 9 years, 10, 11 in my country. And it's really bad. Number 2 is, of course, the teen pregnancies and teen or early marriages rose by 25%. Child-headed homes rose by another 11%. So we are because they lost their parents, during COVID. So we have about 53 estimated to 55% of kids who didn't return to school. And think about that in terms of 10 years, 15 years to come. A country that already is suffering from this kind of poverty, what is it going to be like in 15 years if we don't do something about it? So that's why I want to commend the Institute for bringing people out here to think. We have to think for the future. We really are the people that are given the burden to think for education. And I was listening to the gentleman from Virginia, the professor from Virginia, and I'm thinking, wow, these guys have money. I mean, you're talking billions, and we're like, we didn't have anything. As I told you, I'm also an entrepreneur. I run schools. One of the schools that I run is actually to help girls get in school. Now, imagine we're just struggling to bring kids in, and now they're being forced out, and there's reason for them to stay out there. So in terms of suffering, we took, I think, one of the gravest hits in the world. And the other phenomenon was the exodus by teachers who just couldn't stay. And you can't blame them. They had to fend for their, families, and they left. When they started doing different other, they ventured into other sectors of the economy and realized that they were earning very poorly. And as you know, I don't know about Canada, I don't know that much, but teachers are not paid very well many places in the world. So when these guys got into these professions and these other things, like construction, like business, like fishing, value addition to existing other business ventures, these guys didn't come back. So now, right now, we're having a real severe lack of teachers. And I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, okay, it's all over the world. And it's a big one. So I won't go into so many other things, but the poverty shift is big for us in Africa, on the continent, and I am sure in many other places of the world. We have domestic violence rising. When people are stressed, they're poor, they expend it on the kids, and the kids have taken a lot out of this. So I am so pleased to be here, and I am excited to see that we do something about this. And of course, I thank you.
Fiona, the pleasure is ours. Before we turn to Europe, which had a different experience from North America and Africa, I just want to say that because the Commission did work across 60 countries, some of our most prominent members were able to give us very interesting perspectives, and every country was taking lessons on pretty much the same problems. From Uganda to Argentina, Silvina Gwiertz is one of our most eminent members, now has become the Deputy Minister of Education for all of Argentina, has also done the yard-to-yard at an official level. Tara Demel is former Education Minister of Sri Lanka, very active there. While they couldn't be here, what we also learned is that there are many countries and regions that did not have the same education catastrophe. It is not that all of the world suffered third bucket. That is, some places either didn't close the schools at all for a host of cultural, strategic reasons. Some of them closed them for extremely short periods, knowing that they have to open, otherwise disintegration happens. Thermodynamics oblige. Some of them had very muscular, and here I'm getting to Central Europe, Schulpflicht. They had muscular compulsory attendance requirements. So our Austrian colleagues or our Swiss colleagues look at us like we're Martian here in Canada. What do you mean you had all this third bucket leakage and defection? We had zero. Now, they might have had other things, but they didn't have that. And the other one is that some of the Asian countries, we're talking about Singapore, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, they were much more systematic. They understood, almost engineer-like, that if they close the system, there will be this leakage. So you have to make it up with that compensating energy. So we are Martian in Canada. We are Martian for what happened and what happened on our watch. And to get back to pre-Martian 2019, we're going to have to put in a lot of work. So here we come to Europe. I'm going to start with Biljana in Montenegro. And before we go to what's to be done, the practical, I'm going to ask what happened. Biljana, welcome.
It's really a privilege to be here and talk about situation in Montenegro, what's happened in the COVID period. When we discuss, Irvin and all of us, we discuss, and we have measured that we have to speak 7 minutes, maximum 7 minutes. That it is the reason that I want to read what because I measure my speech, and it's, you know, it's not good to speak lastly, or let's say after all those countries, because as you know, more similarity between us. Yes, we have power, people. Yes, we don't have money. Yes, we have number. For example, for your orientation, all Montenegro has more than 500,000 citizens. Can you imagine how that can live in a small country? But we have here everything as all of you. So, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has profoundly impacted all aspects of our lives, especially education. Many students have faced significant changes in attending schools, and COVID has affected almost all teachers as well. At the same time, parents have been concerned about their children's well-being. As we move forward after the pandemic, we must stay highly ready and make essential changes. If you allow me to say, in all educational systems and all countries on earth. Today, in the post-COVID era, two essential aspects have marked Montenegro and all countries worldwide. First, collectivity experience gained from fighting the pandemic. And second, the commitment to build adaptable and inclusive educational system to provide the best learning experience for all students. Achieving this requires innovative teaching approaches, diverse evaluation methods, and flexible school organization models. One of the main challenges of educational system in Montenegro faced during the pandemic, in the phase after online lessons only, was the reduced number of classrooms and learning spaces, leading to overcrowded classrooms and lack of social distancing, which increased the risk of virus transmission, is revealed by UNICEF research. To ensure a safe learning environment, many schools had to implement hybrid teaching methods and reduce the number of students in classrooms, which resulted in additional costs. Further educational changes were problems related to accessing the internet and learning technologies. Many students lacked the basic equipment to participate in distance learning, leading to issues in keeping up with the curriculum and gaining knowledge. Additionally, many students did not have access to necessary support for educators to overcome learning challenges, leading to low education outcomes, lower achievement to national assessment, poor ranking of students from Montenegro in PISA testing. For example, all our schools until kindergarten to faculty is closed 10 months. We open all our education system in 25th January 2001. Addressing the post-COVID challenges in education means future innovation.
Mic closer to you.
Future,
Yep.
innovation, thank you, and changing in teaching and learning methods, investing in the faster internet connections to all students increasing efforts in digital teaching materials, assessing to the quality of existing technological solutions for education, and providing prompt and expert support for all students is crucial. Building a quality educational system adopted for this new post-pandemic era will require changes, innovations, and readiness to adapt to new demands. To guide the development of educational systems, the following recommendations should be considered. First, continuous development of digital infrastructure, ensuring access to equipment, the internet, electronic educational content for all students and teachers is essential. Second, development of e-learning and hybrid teaching models, encouraging the use of flexible and adapted learning models that incorporate technological innovation alongside adjustments to the curriculum. Third, support for teachers and other staff, adequate resources, professional development, and support must be provided to teachers and other staff to successfully adapt it to new circumstances. 4, regular evaluation in the educational system for continuous education development, assessment of the learning system should be implemented at the national level and with individual institutions themselves. 5th, integrated sustainable development values and principles into educational system, focusing on ecological and sustainable values and principles in the educational curriculum will help future generation of students in the end. In short, implementing these recommendations will lead to more modern, adaptable, and effective educational system in post-pandemic era.
Thank you, Biljana. Can we turn to Eszter, who hovers around the range of important European countries, to tell us what the situation was during the pandemic as you saw it before we talk about the post.
Okay, well, I think that before I go into it, I should also explain what the Help Parents International is doing here. Well, we are a global organization working with different member organizations and partners that either are parent organizations or organizations working with or for parents. And well, we are a child rights organization, which might be surprising, but it's basically the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that is the only legislative piece that defines the rights and duties of parents, and also part of the legal system of each and every country in the world except for the United States. So in brackets, I was not surprised that child rights were totally ignored in the US, but I was pretty much surprised that they were ignored everywhere else. Well, in a lot of places, not everywhere else. Well, our starting point is research showing that the biggest impact on children's attitude towards learning and also towards school is that of the parents up to about age 11, 12. And after that, this role is taken over by the peer group, but parents are still second. So teaching professionals, teachers are always second or third place. Thus, if we want to provide the right education environment, then parents are key. And if you want to have children attending schools, then talking to the parents and collaborating is really, really key. We have different programs all over the world, so we had different experiences. For example, I was just telling our colleagues that we had a large program on the collaboration of families and schools in India that totally fell apart because there was so much hostility between school heads who wanted to keep the schools closed and parents who were demanding the schools to open. We had to stop the program. So at the beginning of this period in 2020, March 2020, we established, we actually expanded our scientific advisory board with virus researchers, epidemiologists, and people who were also focusing on the mental health aspects of this all. And we did quite a lot of research, both with parents and with professionals. So what I have as experiences is, on the one hand, personal and also statistical data. We were demanding the opening of schools already in different messages and manifests by May 2020, when we had all the evidence necessary showing that children are not in any way part of spreading the virus, and that school closures and masks are really detrimental for children. Well, I'm Hungarian, and our organization is registered in the Netherlands, so probably it makes most sense to talk about those countries very briefly. I will start with Hungary because that had a more similar kind of experience than the countries that we have been introduced to. In Hungary, the first wave was in December 2019, January 2020, like in most of Europe, when nobody was talking about COVID. It meant that in March 2020 there were no cases. But Hungary has a very non-democratic prime minister, and he saw great opportunity. So they introduced measures without any cases, basically, including school closures. And they also closed parks. They closed Margaret Island in Budapest, which is one of the biggest recreational area where people could have actually, move around without any danger, even in a severe pandemic. And schools were closed from March to May with a regulation that if the parents asked the school to keep open because they have to go to work, then the schools were obliged to be open. Schools refused. So they actually did not open even if the parents were demanding it. About 25% of the students never showed up in online lessons. They were introduced from Friday to Monday. So Friday there was school, and Monday schools were supposed to teach online. Also, sixth graders, about 6-year-old first graders to read and write. And also about 25% of the teachers disappeared, although they had all the means. So they had laptops, they had internet connection, they just did not want to do anything online. But of course there were also schools that were doing a lot of efforts, especially in smaller settlements. So primary school teachers will go from door to door, supporting the learning, especially of younger children. In Hungary, the problem is also amplified by the fact that Hungary has the highest level of child poverty in the European Union. So about 19% of children are actually starving if they don't get school meals, and school meals were stopped. So it was not just about the learning happening at school, but also it was about children starving. We did 3 large-scale research projects in Hungary with parents, and it was really interesting how the interest in, or the demand in opening the schools actually increased the number of participants, because we were surveying the members of the National Parents Association. The first round, which was November 2020, there was rumor that they would close the schools again. And also some schools one-sidedly introduced social distancing measures and mask mandates. And in the first round, we had 15,000 replies from parents, with over 2/3 of them saying that even, at that time only hand sanitization was compulsory. Even that was considered too much by over 2/3 of the parents. So they were aware of the situation, the real situation. We had a very high percentage of parents who worked in healthcare, who answered already in the first round, and they were totally against any kinds of restrictions around children. And then of course, they closed the schools again, and the schools were closed until April 21. So it was nearly 5 months. Then they started talking about reopening the schools, and the 2 teacher trade unions, they have a kind of fake parent organization that they are teacher trade unionists. They said that less than 25% of the parents will let the children go to school if the schools reopen. And that's when we had the second round of research with over 47,000 as compared to the 15,000, because people were really passionate. And according to our measurements, 78% was ready to send their school immediately. Then the schools opened, and the reality on day 1 was 75%. On day 5, it was 99%. So families were really demanding school opening. Well, and after that, there were no more school closures. There was a period when children who did not get the vaccine were severely discriminated. And for some reason, pediatricians were not as willing to give free papers as for any other vaccine. So there was a period when children had a great problem, because if there was half a year when if there was one positive test in the school, everybody who was unvaccinated was sent home for a week. Totally healthy children. And at that time, that was really the problematic one, because even today, about 90% of children are not vaccinated, even today. That at that time, schools were forbidden to give any support to the children, so there was no online alternative. So this is Hungary. There is one interesting outcome. In very low socioeconomic status families, very often the older siblings disappeared. They did not participate in online lessons because they had to teach the younger ones. And what happened, what we see from afterwards, is that these children who had to teach their siblings had a big jump in their skills level, because by explaining, they actually learned. So there were also positive outcomes. We don't have third bucket in Hungary because it's compulsory to go to school, and if you don't send your children to school, then you don't get family support, financial support. So it's basically a mindset issue. Parents send the children to school, they tell them that it's bad for you, we know that, but otherwise we cannot feed you. And I think it's just as bad as third bucket kids. In the Netherlands, the situation was totally different. I think that we should have a moment of admiration for Sweden, who actually followed science and never had any restrictions. The Dutch approach was pretty much the same until April 2020, when the Prime Minister realized that, okay, this is science, but if we do what the Swedes do, we will be isolated, because the Swedish were treated as paria in Europe. So, and there was also a lot of pressure from the neighboring country, Belgium, where there were severe measures, and the situation in the two countries was very similar. The numbers in the Netherlands with no measures were much better throughout the pandemic than Belgium, because, well, we know that fear is the worst enemy, so bad numbers were always based on fear. So what happened was that in early April 2020, they closed the schools for 6 weeks. But there was a very big difference from other countries. On the one hand, school leaders were officially told that you are an autonomous leader and you decide if you want to close or not, although there was an order to close. So even at that time, a lot of schools did not close. And also municipalities immediately started programs offering tablet computers and laptops to any family who did not have one. So it was a much better period, and also every week when the Prime Minister had an address, a press conference, every week it was included in his speech that, dear parents, please make your children go together and be together. So it was a totally different message. Nearly all schools fully opened their schoolyards and sports facilities outside. So even if the building was closed, the sport grounds and the schoolyards and playgrounds were open for the whole local community. And what you could see is that from morning until the end of working hours, it was full of kids, and then the parents joined. So it was a very, very different mental experience. And after that, in July 2020, there were some rumors about the possibility of introducing masks on public transport. And the head of the National Public Health Institute had a press conference, and he said that if there will be any restrictions, it will be a political decision because they have no scientific ground. And this had a very big impact on how people were thinking. So in 2020, in the autumn, they started the Christmas vacation earlier than planned. with the plan of having an extended one, so it was another kind of short school closure. But at that time, basically no schools actually closed. We did a research project on the traumas children experienced in different countries. It was a project done in the UK, Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Greece. And while in all the other countries apart from the Netherlands, this massive blaming of children, telling them, although we had all the evidence that it's not true, that they're going to kill their grandparents just by the two children were playing together, had a huge impact on long-lasting traumas. In the Netherlands, the most important trauma that we could measure, and what also senior leaders were reporting, is that there was one thing that was closed. It was old people's homes. But unlike in many other countries, it did not mean that the elderly people became isolated, but it meant that the families brought them home. So for a lot of Dutch children, the biggest trauma of this period was that they had to give up their room for the grandparents who moved to the family home from an old people's home. So it was very, very different. And what we also see, and I want to close with that, is that we have to consider, when you talk about energy, when you talk about the reason for going to school, that together with this blaming them, labeling them as granny killers, telling them that they are doing something bad if they are behaving like children or young people. Parallel with that, we measure a tremendous growth in climate panic, in their view that they don't have a future at all. And also in the European context, I have no idea how much it is an issue in North America, but I know that it's not an issue in Asia or Africa. In Europe, the Ukrainian war also have a huge impact. And they are just building on each other. There is no release, and we have to consider all of them.
That's great. Powerful start. Thank you, Esther. I want to turn again to Shantha and ask, you mentioned that the government was very weak or absent during the school closures, during the ouster, but now you're coming back from a distance. Starting here in Canada, India is considered one of the leaders of the 21st century, but on the ground, could there not be an apprehension of the consequences of what's happened to the children for India's future? And in light of that, what's being done now to reconstitute education in the future, and as Esther was saying, to re-energize the youth for tomorrow? And I'm aware that in our work on the Commission, there are different practices in different states. So Tamil Nadu is very different from Maharashtra.
Actually, I thought I must endorse what she said about the parental demand for education and how much they care for their children's education. We had several protests going on asking for reopening of schools. If they could reopen malls, hotels, theaters, why not schools for children? But it just didn't work. Anyway, coming back to the post-pandemic and the government response, as you just said, India has 28, it's a federal nation. It has 28 states, 9 union territories. It is diverse in terms of culture, economic background, in terms of institutional memory, in terms of corruption of the education system. On practically every aspect, there is a kind of a diversity. And it is within this diversity that there has been some responses to the pandemic at the state and the central level. Education is in the concurrent list of the Constitution, which means that the union government and the state government have equal share in making policies for the children. Now, post-pandemic, I'll try to be as brief as possible. There was this national education policy that was designed, and the emphasis was on two issues. One was on tracking of children, and the second was on strengthening foundation learning and numeracy program. These two were the emphasis of the national government, and also the states also had decided to follow the national policy on trying to track, identify and bring all out-of-school children back into school. But tracking had several different strands in different states. Some had adopted a campaign approach, some had adopted a volunteer approach. In fact, in a couple of states, they collaborated with the UNICEF and had documentation of the names of children in a software and put them all in the database that these are the out-of-school children. So in a way, the tracking was an important thing that had happened on policy papers mainly. In practice, it has been entering of the names of children, as many as possible, in the data bank and the data source. But in terms of actually getting the children back into school, it varied from state to state. So what one would think is that it made an efficient use of centralized data to bring names of children into the software. While the names came, it was not the children who came into the school. But the names, certainly the children were identified, the names were identified, but children in some places came back to school, in some places they have not come back to school. But even getting the names back into school was a claim that many state governments thought was important. In some places like Jammu and Kashmir, they did geotagging of children. Again, a very good use of the software. So in a way, tracking of children followed a lot of data resources, data bank, and this kind of effort that went into it. Now, the second thing that happened was in the foundation learning. Here too, each state has its own interventions. In fact, as you mentioned, in the state of Tamil Nadu, about 3 million children were reached out to, and they had a huge ground base of youth volunteers who were trained and who went to the neighborhood, who went to schools, brought those children back into schools and taught them to read and write. They played games, they did theater, and they created a mood where children would want to come back to schools. That was full of energy. It happened in 3 or 4 other states also. And you must know that it is when a state takes up the program, when the government takes up a program, it runs into millions, contacts with millions of children, millions of parents. The scale is really huge. It's not like an NGO, but when the government takes up, it is really huge. And they introduced remedial learning, bridge courses for children in many places. The remedial learning again was diverse. In some places it was for 6 to 9-year-old. In some places it was from class 1 to class 8. In some places it was for high school children. So there was no uniformity, but there were efforts made to see that children came back to school and they learned through bridge courses. Where I think I was looking at all the proposals that state governments made to the central government before coming here, and the review of what the literature through the evidence of it's all on the net on what they did. It seemed there were 3 basic thrusts that had happened. One is centralization, which I think had reduced the autonomy of the school teacher. All planning were made at the provincial level in each state, and they designed the textbooks, they designed the worksheets, they designed the assessment sheets, they designed practically everything hour to hour, day to day, and they distributed it to the schools, trained the teachers and told them that you will have to follow what we have said. Now, this I felt was actually hitting at the teacher, a professional autonomy of the teacher, and taking over the function of the teacher by the State Council of Education, Research and Training, in a way undermining or disempowering the teacher, and that seems to be a huge trend that has happened. Centralization, even earlier it was there, but post-COVID it has become even more apparent. that this kind of centralization, which hits at what a teacher has to do, the kind of energy you were talking about, the connection with the child, the interaction with the child, the environment you create, all that has gone for a 6. And it's completely centralized. The second thing that has happened really is, I would think even more, I do not know what stand to take on this really, is the digitization of knowledge. On every issue that the teacher has been asked to do, he has to or she has to enter it into the database. If there is an assessment of a child, the assessment of a child is broken into some 4 or 5 indicators. Has a child learned to do this? Has a child learned to do this? And the teacher has to tick every day. And so it's become a mechanical task where the teacher is spending at least an hour a day ticking, and then that information is then sent through the net to the block level, and then they collate the information and send it to the district level. They collate and send it to the state, and then it goes to the central government. And it is just not that they tick, they have to do both manual entry of information as well as data entry of information. So I would think there is some kind of a data terrorism happening in the education system today. Teachers are much more involved in data entry because they're being monitored and supervised on what they're going to be doing the next day and the next day. So there is a homogenization of the teacher, there's a homogenization of the child as well. And many of the teachers who are disoriented, who are lazy, they're quite welcomed this kind of a system. Because before coming here, I spoke to some teachers asking them, do you like this? So some teachers said, it's good, we just stick and we come away. But there are some real genuine teachers whom I know, who are part of my child rights group and child rights activism. They were so disheartened. They said that all these years we took pride in getting a child her education, in teaching her, and a pride that the child has become something in her life. And we have alumni who come back to school and say, teacher, I'm so happy to be your student. Now this seems to be a cutting in that interaction between the teacher and the child. And this digitization, to me, I think it's become quite monstrous, but I do not know, as I'm not an educationist, but I look at it as something which has alienated the teacher from the child. And it seems to be driven by a space that was created through the COVID times, where you have these, corporate sector just rushing in to fill in that space. We had the global summit of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and the major recommendation they made was about digitization of education. That was a mantra for any education intervention in the country. So that to me, I do not know. We will have to see what the consequence of this is for India's education and the next generation of children. Maybe I'm wrong, but right now I'm very, very skeptical about what is happening to education in India through digital learning. There was this Byju's which entered into a huge contract with one of the state governments. Byju's, I'm sure some of you know, is a huge education technocratic corporate. And somewhere Byju's defaulted over its global commitments and the whole system collapsed. In the meantime, iPads were distributed, smart screens were distributed, TVs were distributed. Somewhere the government became consumer of all the products that the digital learning devices are. They are not educationists. Even me dealing with children, I would not claim to be an educationist. Here you find the technocrats who have taken over the space of education. You give up on all your theorists who have done so much to understand what theory of education is about. We have a 4-year degree course on education to become a teacher. Those who are advising on education did no course on teaching and learning. They did only on course on how to input and output data. and how to do all the measurements, how to do even the vocabulary estate. Is it replicable? Is it sustainable? Is it standardized? You know, we never heard these words in an education program. The totally different vocabulary has taken over the education system. It's not just a trend. Even in the reports of every state to the central government, they have shown with pride what they have done with the digitization. They have digitized teacher promotion policy. They have digitized grievance mechanism. They have digitized transfer. They have digitized purchase and distribution of material and everything. I'm afraid that after 10 years, it will not be an education system, but it will be a digitized system. So the first is the centralized system. Second is the digitization. The third is there is just no noise about equity in education. There is so much of differentiation in schools. The rich schools are different from the poor, and even in the state public schools, some schools are better endowed, some are not. The investments are not coming, the budgets are not being made. It's not the question of unspent amounts. The amount is just not allocated. And there is noise about improving quality of education, but they have not seen the link between equality, the issue of equity and education. How can you talk about quality of education without improving your infrastructure, your teacher, your teachers' support systems, you know, and then you expect quality to happen. There is a school without bathroom, there is a school without teacher, and then you want children to learn and make magic happen. So in a way, it seems that they have forgotten the question of democratizing schools. They've forgotten the question of equality in schools. They've forgotten the question of diversification yet in schools, cultural diversity. And they're not looking at these principles, values of education. They're only looking at pushing in some worksheets and getting children to fill up those worksheets. And even the children won't know what they are writing, the teachers don't know what writing, but certainly the entire system knows that 90% of children have pushed in their data into their education system. So I am not very happy with the you must be knowing by now, I am not very happy with the post-pandemic situation. It's created a space for people who are not educationists, and I'm afraid if it can happen, and I'm sure there are going to be global evaluations of this great system in India. There will be great people from the World Bank or wherever saying this is working, you know, because numbers always work. And then it can be, if it works in some remote place in India, it can work in anywhere in the country, and it would be taken to scale all over the world, and I'm afraid about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantha. Can I ask if India is one of the major countries of Asia and indeed the world, then what about Uganda? Uganda is looked at as a major African country. Surely leaders in Uganda, education, policy, and political alike, must by now understand the consequences of those 2 years of school closures. So what is being done to reconstitute the schools, to bring energy back to the learning for the sake of the country's future?
Thank you, Irvin. In the case of Uganda, the government has made an attempt to, increase the budget for education, and there are policies that are being put in place to especially bring back some of the kids that they think are lost between the cracks. So girls, for example, are given an opportunity to come back to school if they fell pregnant, and there are also after-school programs that have been put in place to make sure that some of those problems are curbed. But because the numbers that have been lost so high, it's still not a very successful program. But at least attempts have been made to make sure that education is being prioritized as a sector Yeah, before it was really bad. So post-pandemic, we're seeing a shift in government, prioritization of education. So we think that if this program continues, we might, be able to, may not save everybody, but be able to bring back dignity of education as a priority in the budget, in the connectivity. For example, why we didn't have successes with the first and second buckets is because of lack of connectivity. So right now, priority is given to IT professionals to, improve on connectivity of, schools to schools, and even an effort is being made to connect schools in Uganda to schools abroad. Because why we suffered so much is because the infrastructure was not in place for connectivity. And also, there was not a commitment to that at all, even though they would money would be spent on IT, but through corruption it would go different ways. But right now, is this keenness that has been apportioned to that subject. So we're seeing that the government has made some effort because of the vast numbers that were lost through the cracks. So we think that if this goes on, we'll be able to improve on education. Simple things like just washing your hands, improved a lot of health, for example. So we're seeing that little things that are being done during the pandemic have continued post-pandemic and have, for example, reduced on infections. So we're thinking that if more and more attention is paid to education, we may not get all the kids back, but we'll be able to improve on the systems. And also, something that is important here that I haven't heard anybody mention, or somebody mention and I missed it, is the vocational attempts to reach kids vocationally. Because they've already gone into these trades, they've touched money, it's sweet. They're not thinking about, if someone was 15 and they got money in their hands and they are now 17 by the time they want them to go back to school, they refuse to go back. First of all, they had the permission. Secondly, now they've earned, so it's hard to get them back. But if apprentices or if vocational training is afforded to these kids, they will be a better people, and they'll serve the country better. So those are the two areas where focus has been put and that we expect a yield from. Of course, the economies matter, and the budgets may not be as big, but the commitment is there for now. Maybe like Jamaica, there might be more commitment. I was wondering when the gentleman from Jamaica was speaking, and I was like, where did they get all these people so committed? Because the pandemic was new. Everybody feared COVID, so how people were able to do that is really commendable. But I think I've answered your question, did I? Thank you very much.
That's great, and we're going to end with Eszter and Biljana quickly, and then very quick round of questions before we go to lunch. And the way I want to pivot to Eszter is we had started a conversation about energy, and energy is, I would hope, as a general concept or metaphor, as a major lesson coming out of the school closures in the pandemic period for education and for the kids to have sufficient runway to prepare for tomorrow. And I just want to give a shout out to Bob Pianta and our American colleagues, because whenever we were down on the Canadian side of the commission and we get on these conferences that we'd run online across 60 countries, every time the Canadians spoke, we were even keel and moderate, but when the Americans spoke, there was all of a sudden a spike in energy. and Florida and Arkansas, and I felt like I could swim Lake Superior after that call, and then I would hear again from British Columbia, and I knew I was lower energy, and then Bob would speak, and then it's Lake Superior again. So we're going to count on the Europeans to provide some of that energy as well. So Eszter, over to you.
Well, first of all, I want to make a step back from 2020, and I want to go back to 2018, when the World Bank published a major review of the education outcomes globally. And what they highlighted is that at that point of time, the real problem was that it wasn't that children were not attending school, but the problem was that children are actually attending school. They are even finishing school on paper, but they leave school without basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. Since you were asking me to talk about Europe, I did not look up. They have statistics in blocks, so they will have statistics for North America. But what I know is that in Eastern Europe, 1 in 5 children were in that situation, finishing school, no basic reading and writing skills. 1 in 5, and 1 in 3 in arithmetics. And Eastern and Central Europe has strong education systems. So that was one thing that we already suffered from, and most probably those children you call third bucket who are out of school. I would always try to tell you not to say out of education, because every moment of your life is education, but out of school are most probably those children who were not provided by the school with the basic skills. So one thing that we have to focus on for sure is strengthening the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. On the other hand, what is also a positive outcome of the last years, even in countries where there were long school closures, is that there were lots of other scenes of learning that became much more active. Museums, libraries, parks, individual, non-formal or informal educators, youth organizations, they were providing children with something really meaningful. And also, with digitalization, I fully agree with that. If it's a lot of administration, that's really bad. But what digitalization is really good for is to support individual learning needs. And in many countries, not just in Europe, but also it's a thing in North America, what we call micro-credential courses have been emerging, and the age group is going more and more down. So even 10, 12-year-olds can have certificates in a short online course specializing in something that the school should not and could not and should not provide for, because it's very specialized knowledge. So utilizing digitalization for supporting individual learning needs, special learning needs, is a very important thing. In Europe, we talk a lot about open schooling, which in the European context means that school is still a center of learning, but it has a very active relationship with all the other learning spaces around. They have a learning and teaching community, and that can help attract as many children as possible, not just to go to the school and be there as a vegetable, but also to attend the school as a really enjoyable place. What is very, very crucial, and what we have to work on, is that teachers in these schools, in open schools, should become leaders of learning. So with their professional knowledge, they should really take leadership. And that's where we need a lot of teacher training. The general approach of teacher trade unions is not really helpful in Europe. So it is a difficulty in the European context. In other contexts, might not be a problem. Also, teacher shortages are everywhere in the world. And alternative pathways to the teaching profession. So people who were accomplished in a certain profession, they are close to retirement, they don't want to continue what they were doing until then, but they can join schools and be there as like semi-trained, like grandfathers, grandmothers, is also a very important thing that we should support because teacher shortages will be there, but there are people who want to join from the side. And the last thing I want to say, because we were speaking a lot about the mental health and well-being of children, is that what most people realized in the last 3 years, I think this is something that we need to build on, is that while most of the first and second world countries have been focusing an awful lot of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, people have reinvented themselves and explored much more arts and humanities. So I think that we have a blessed moment when schools can provide much more in the field of arts and humanities. And well, you know, a lot of people, when they were ordered to stay at home, they started doing something artistic, because even if mental health provisions are relatively scarce, artistic expression is very, very important for maintaining your mental health and raising your well-being level. So that would be my key messages.
That's great. And quickly, Biljana, and then Safaraz will circulate. There are a couple of questions back there. Biljana.
Our third basket is Roma children and Roma families. And I deeply want to share with all of you that our major minority in Montenegro is Roma people. And thanks to UNICEF and Pedagogical Centar, we are just two institutions in Montenegro who help the Roma families and children. And I think that is a right place to keep in mind, all of us, that all our countries has problem with minorities. So what I want to say that it's crucially important to thinking about minority in all our country, because unfortunately in my country many people didn't in the COVID period didn't understand that some people existing around us without anything, nothing at all, nothing. That's mean that to improve minority education in post-COVID era, the following recommendations are crucial. Adaptation of educational practices, please keep in mind that it's very important. Schools should be more flexible in adapting to different learning styles. You mentioned that different learning styles and recognize diversity among students, especially concerning cultural and linguistic issues in differences in learning and to educational environment. Second, inclusive education. We still have in Montenegro, and I see in everywhere, we talk minimum 20 years ago, all the time, inclusive education. But we are still in the beginning. For example, schools should actively work on creating inclusive educational environment that respects all students, regardless of their ethnic or linguistic backgrounds or any other form or of their diversity. 3, improved dialogue between schools and minority communities is crucial. One of the message that we send all of us and for all our government, establishing a dialogue between educational institutions and the representatives of minority communities is crucial to understand the specific challenge they face and to ensure support and the recognition of the needs of students, needs of students from minority communities. 4th, monitoring and reporting on inequalities, initiatives such as data collection and reporting on inequalities can provide important insights into different dimensions of inequality in educational system and call on the public, schools, and governments to take action to improve changes. Fifth, integrating ICT technologies and tools in minority education, as well as rest of the children's, to use of innovative technologies, such as internet platforms and smartphones, can provide schools with better access to minority, especially those living in rural or isolated areas, to improve the overall quality of education. In conclusion, we all must focus on what we have learned from this situation. We have learned that flexibility is crucial. Flexibility is crucial for all our countries and all our government, and all the key words is flexibility. We must be ready to adapt the changes and use new technologies. Volens nolens, I'm generation, baby boom generation. It is not my cup of tea, but I must be on track. So, according to your Shantha and your speech, I understand that absolutely you, but this is a reality, you know what I mean? And I need to see your eyes, all of your eyes, I need this, but we testimony that we have generation, fourth or fifth generation, they are different of, you know, that is the fourth. And additionally, we have learned that support and collaboration are extremely important. This is a situation that we have opportunities to share knowledge and experience and spirit through collective efforts. We can support students, teachers, and parents to ensure no one is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Biljana.
much.
Very quickly, we have 2 minutes for questions. We had one question in the back there, and we have a beautiful lunch awaiting, so the continuation of the conversation thereafter. Go ahead.
My name's Andrea Brunner, and I work for a women's organization here in Toronto, and we have a girls support center. So I've worked with the girls support center for many years. And I'm really glad that you brought up, you know, the impact on girls and women specifically. We know in Canada and globally, the data is showing that the impacts have just been greater on girls, increased depression, stress, increased disordered eating, self-harm, suicide attempts, and of course on women and moms. So I guess what is of interest to me is, you know, the way the school education system cannot go back to the way it was pre-pandemic. It can't look the same because the students aren't the same, and what they're living with now at home, at school, relationally, is different. And so I guess, is it the school's role to provide some of these needs? And why I'm saying that is because we as community organizations kind of fill the gap, right? And here in Toronto, at least, teachers will often say, I'm not a social worker, I'm here to teach, you know, English, math, and those things. And then the community organizations are doing mental health support because we can't get our youth a psychiatrist or an ongoing therapist, and we're now a food bank and all of these things. How can the education system play a role in, like, I appreciate you saying the arts, but do they have a role in some of these things? Like, for me, I think yes, but what would that look like now? And of course, more funding is needed.
It's a great question. I'm only going to give everyone 30 seconds, literally, and then we're going to take that into lunch and start off with that on the next panel because lunch awaits. Eszter.
Yeah, I think that we can talk a lot more about the gender dimension. It is becoming a very challenging issue because in the European context, it's totally clear that the school as it was or as it has been until now is not really suitable for boys. So while still gender equality policies are for giving possibilities to girls, boys are falling behind and they are falling out of school. And what is becoming even more challenging is whether there can be a discourse about the different needs of different genders in general. I believe we do have to talk about it, so being gender blind or whatever is not going to help us. But sports and arts are really, really key when it comes to dealing with anybody's well-being and mental health needs.
Now, I just wanted to say the schools are the hubs for equality, for gender equality, for inclusiveness, for democratization. I think they are the base for creating values of should be, and wherever there are efforts, they are also. It's not that it's not happening. There are several NGOs working for democratization of schools, and it's possible, it's doable, and I think they're the best institutions for creating equality of all kinds and non-discrimination of all kinds.
I think everything I wanted to say has been said. I would just say that inclusion of all stakeholders is really important. We have seen that some girls who have gone through things, even without training, have been able to support each other. So community participation, peer participation, parents, we all have a place in this work. And for organizations like ours and yours who really help girls and women, it's important to sensitize communities, but also to make sure that all stakeholders are part of the solution other than the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Shantha, Eszter, and Biljana. Warm round of applause. Terrific panel, and colleagues, please, a few housekeeping notes. We're a little behind schedule, so it'll be a shorter lunch, but even more importantly than lunch is that we gather for the group photo. Once we get going, after you eat, we'll gather for a group photo. It's a historic photo, so we have a very strong-willed photographer who will bring us all together, either inside or outside. Watch for her orders, and we will see you for the Canadian context after lunch. Thanks for a great morning.